Geneva, February 2026. In a closed room of a Swiss hotel, negotiators from the United States and Iran sat face to face again, for the third time since the 12-day war, which, in June 2025, left 3 Iranian nuclear facilities partially destroyed by U.S. and Israeli bombings. Mediation is carried out by the Sultanate of Oman, a country that insists on the power of diplomacy when all logic points to the definitive collapse of negotiations. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi declared that the meeting produced good progress. Trump threatened additional bombings if diplomacy failed, and Vice President J.D. Vance was surgical. The principle is very simple: Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. At the same time, Iran refuses to discuss its ballistic missile program, maintains uranium enrichment as an untouchable red line, and has blocked IAEA inspectors from accessing the attacked facilities. Apparently, we are facing yet another round of fruitless diplomatic negotiations between powers that deeply hate and distrust each other. More news about a conflict frozen in time. Another chapter in the eternal nuclear dispute in the Middle East. But what if it wasn't that? What if what we were seeing wasn't a negotiation on the brink of collapse, but rather the deliberate execution of a strategy that was conceived decades ago? What if Iran, instead of appearing as a reactive and cornered actor, was playing the game according to rules that its adversaries have not yet fully understood? To answer these questions, it is necessary to go back more than 2 centuries, to the icy steppes of Russia in 1812, and find a general who understood something that continues to be subversive to this day: that victory does not always belong to the strongest, the fastest, or the most aggressive. Sometimes victory belongs to those who are wise enough not to fight on the enemy's terms. His name was Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov, and its strategy, the deliberate attrition, the refusal of direct confrontation, the war that cannot be won on the field but is won through time, could be the key to understanding what Iran has been doing during the last decades in the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East. In this video we will analyze what really happened in the 2025 to 2026 negotiations between Iran and the USA, show the historical and strategic context that explains Iranian behavior, identify the real interests of each actor in this conflict, including Russia and China, and build possible scenarios for the coming years. The big question that will remain in the air is this: are we facing a defeated and collapsing Iran, or are we facing a modern Kutuzov patiently executing his strategy of attrition? The 12-day war and the paradox of negotiations. In June 2025, Israel launched a large-scale air offensive against Iran, with direct participation from the United States through the bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. The operation became known as the 12-day war, a designation that is itself revealing, as it suggests a limited and controlled time window, not an all-out war. Reported fact: the US and Israel attacked Iranian nuclear facilities in June 2025, including Natanz, considered the heart of Iran's uranium enrichment program. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated during the attacks, according to Iranian state media, and was replaced by an interim council. Analytical interpretation: what the US and Israel declared as a preventative action to eliminate Iran's nuclear capability produced a paradoxical result. Instead of forcing Tehran's capitulation, the attacks destroyed 5 rounds of negotiations that were underway in Rome and Muscat, eliminated the main Iranian interlocutor, Khamenei, and created a power vacuum that made any agreement even more difficult to reach. After the attacks, Iran began retaliation against countries in the Middle East that host North American military bases: the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Iraq. The message was clear: any U.S. ally in the region would pay a price. American envoy Steve Witkoff, real estate billionaire and close ally of Trump, leads the American delegation. On the Iranian side, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, the mediator, is the Sultanate of Oman, a neutral actor that has historically served as a diplomatic channel between Tehran and Washington. The current positions are as follows. The U.S. demands complete suspension of uranium enrichment, zero enrichment position, control of the long-range ballistic missile program, and an end to Iranian support for groups such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Iran refuses any discussion about ballistic missiles, which it considers an integral part of its sovereign defense, and zero enrichment, which it considers a violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Tehran agrees to discuss limitations on its nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. A technical fact is essential to understand the gravity of the situation. Before the attacks in June 2025, Iran had accumulated almost 9,900 kilos of enriched uranium, some at 60%, a level very close to the 90% needed for military use. After the attacks, Iran declared that it had suspended enrichment, but blocked IAEA inspectors from accessing the attacked facilities. Satellite images analyzed by the Associated Press indicate continued activity at two of the affected locations. The language used by both sides is itself a piece of geopolitical analysis. Vice President J.D. Vance says Trump wants to resolve this issue diplomatically, but has other options. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Iran is always trying to rebuild elements of its nuclear program. On the Iranian side, Deputy Minister Majid Takhtravanchi declares that the ball is in the U.S.'s court and that an agreement is possible if they are sincere. Analytical interpretation. The diplomatic language of both sides serves for domestic consumption as much as for the international community. Trump needs to show firmness to his electoral base. The Iranian regime, after Khamenei's assassination and with ongoing internal protests, needs to demonstrate that it does not give in to military pressure. Neither side has short-term incentives for a comprehensive agreement. The third round of negotiations in Geneva in February 2026 ended with what the Omani foreign minister described as significant progress, a deliberately vague formulation that allows each side to narrate the meeting as a partial victory for their respective audiences. The technical talks were scheduled for Vienna, at the IAEA headquarters. Russia and China, which were parties to the original 2015 nuclear deal, JCPOA, expressed concern about the military escalation but refrained from direct intervention. Moscow, involved in Ukraine, is interested in maintaining Iran as a strategic partner without assuming the costs of direct defense. Beijing, with energy and commercial interests in the region, prefers diplomacy to confrontation. Israel, for its part, publicly declares that the June 2025 attacks obliterated Iranian nuclear facilities, but the exact damage remains unknown because Tehran prevented international inspectors from entering. This ambiguity is, as we will see, central to Iranian strategy. The Geneva event is not isolated news. It is the visible surface of a process that has been going on since 1979, and which can only be understood by looking at its historical and strategic depth. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the largest army Europe had ever seen across a border, some 600,000 men, known as the Grande Armée, entering Russian territory. Napoleon was the man who had defeated Prussia, Austria, and almost all of continental Europe. His reputation was one of invincibility. His style of warfare was one of quick decision, movement, total battle. Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov understood, with a clarity that his contemporaries were slow to recognize, that fighting Napoleon on his own terms was tantamount to certain defeat. Kutuzov refused decisive battles, strategically retreated. He abandoned Moscow, the holy city of Russia, without fighting a battle. His own generals and Tsar Alexander I considered this a betrayal, a cowardice, a humiliating capitulation. But Kutuzov knew what he was doing. His strategy was based on four pillars that modern military analysts continue to study. First, refuse the battlefield that the enemy chose. Second, stretch the opponent's supply lines until they collapse. Third, using time and territory as weapons. And fourth, preserve its own combat capacity for when the balance of forces reversed. Napoleon entered Moscow in September 1812 and found a city almost empty, and soon on fire. He waited for the Tsar to capitulate. That capitulation never came. The Russian winter has arrived. Supply lines collapsed. The Grand Army began to fall apart. The withdrawal from Moscow between October and December 1812 was one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. Out of 600,000 men, less than 100,000 returned in combat status. Kutuzov did not win the war by defeating Napoleon in a major confrontation. He won by refusing to lose, by preserving what was essential, by letting the enemy destroy himself, by playing the long game while the opponent demanded quick results. To understand Iranian strategy, it is necessary to understand the depth of the isolation that Tehran has faced since 1979. The Islamic Revolution transformed Iran from a strategic ally of the US, the gendarme of the Gulf under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, into a declared adversary of Washington and Tel Aviv. Since then, Iran has faced a devastating war with Iraq between 1980 and 1988, during which the US supported Saddam Hussein, including with precursors to chemical weapons, decades of progressively more stifling economic sanctions, selective assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists and military personnel attributed to the Israeli Mossad, the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, ordered by Trump, cyber attacks on the nuclear program, the Stuxnet virus, jointly developed by the USA and Israel, and in 2025, direct attacks on nuclear installations. Analytical interpretation. Each of these aggressions, from the Iranian perspective, reinforce the conviction that the nuclear program is not an option, but an existential necessity. Iran observed the fate of Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, who gave up his nuclear program in 2003 and was deposed and murdered in 2011 with Western support. He observed the fate of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which had no weapons of mass destruction and was invaded anyway. Tehran's strategic conclusion is clear. The bomb is the only effective life insurance against forced regime change. The Iranian strategy of attrition does not only operate at the nuclear level. Tehran has, over decades, built what its strategists call an axis of resistance, a network of allied groups and proxies distributed across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with an arsenal of more than 100,000 missiles ahead of the 2024 conflict, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, who attacked trade routes in the Red Sea in 2023 to 2024, disrupting global trade, and Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. This network fulfills exactly the function that Kutuzov assigned to his irregular forces, the Cossacks and the guerrillas who stretched and wore down Napoleon's Grand Army while Kutuzov preserved the hardcore of the regular army. Iran may be attacked directly, but its strategic tentacles remain. They can be weakened, as Hezbollah was in 2024, but not eliminated completely without enormous regional cost. The parallel between Kutuzov and Iranian strategy is not a poetic metaphor. It is a structural homology. In both cases, the weaker actor militarily faces an opponent overwhelmingly superior in conventional war power. In both cases, the answer is the refusal of direct and total confrontation. In both cases, the strategy involves stretching the opponent's resources, multiplying their costs, and playing the long game. And in both cases, the weaker actor preserves what is essential: its ability to survive and its internal legitimacy, while the adversary spends resources and credibility. Trump wants quick results, a grand deal that he can present as victory before the election or in the annals of his presidency. Iran, like Kutuzov, does not need to win. It just needs to not lose, to survive, to preserve enough nuclear capability so that any adversary would know that an all-out attack would have unpredictable consequences, and to keep its regional allies active enough to make any American military solution permanently costly. Iran's strategic objective: the survival of the Islamic regime and international recognition of its nuclear sovereignty. Not necessarily the bomb itself, but the latent capacity to produce it, which works as a deterrent. Possible gains: an agreement that lifts economic sanctions in exchange for verifiable, but not total limitations on the nuclear program would allow the Iranian regime to alleviate domestic economic pressure, which fuels popular protests. The regime gains legitimacy by showing that it resisted American and Israeli military pressure and negotiated as equals. Risks involved: the collapse of negotiations and new military strikes could irreversibly damage Iran's nuclear facilities, eliminate decades of investment, and potentially trigger an internal insurrection that the regime would be unable to control, especially after Khamenei's death and in a context of growing protests. The Iranian narrative for domestic consumption is precisely constructed. The US and Israel are the aggressors. Iran is the victim that resists with dignity. Negotiations are a tactical concession, not a strategic capitulation. Deputy Minister Takhtravanchi was explicit. When we were attacked by the Israelis and Americans, it was our missiles that helped us. This statement serves two purposes. It justifies the refusal to negotiate missiles and presents military capacity as proof of successful resistance. U.S. strategic objective: prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. which would alter the regional balance of power permanently and irreversibly. Secondarily, guarantee Israel's security and maintain American primacy in the Middle East. Possible gains. An agreement that dismantles Iran's nuclear program would be presented by Trump as a historic triumph of the maximum pressure policy. The alternative, an Iran with a bomb, would make any future presidency hostage to a transformed geopolitical reality. Risks involved. The U.S. faces the same trap that Napoleon faced in 1812, the pressure to achieve quick, visible results in a situation that favors slowness and resistance. A prolonged military campaign in Iran would drag the U.S. into the biggest conflict in the Middle East since Iraq in 2003, with unpredictable consequences for the price of oil, regional stability, and the cohesion of American alliances. Analytical interpretation. The American dilemma is structural. The maximum pressure policy works well for negotiations with actors who have short-term incentives to compromise. Iran, like Kutuzov, has no such incentives. The regime prefers resistance to what it perceives as existential capitulation. Each additional round of pressure confirms the Iranian narrative that only nuclear capability guarantees the state's survival. Israel's strategic objective: eliminate Iran's nuclear capability before it becomes irreversible. For Tel Aviv, an Iran with a bomb is not just a strategic threat, it is an existential threat, given the Islamic Republic's discourse of eliminating Israel for decades. Possible gains. The destruction of Iranian nuclear facilities in June 2025 was presented as a decisive breakthrough, but ambiguity about the actual damage and continued Iranian activity observed by satellite suggests that the gains were partial and temporary. Risks involved. Israel has created a problem that strategists describe as the return dilemma. Each attack that does not definitively eliminate Iran's nuclear capability motivates Iran to accelerate and disperse its program, making it even more difficult to destroy. Additionally, the June 2025 attacks eliminated 5 rounds of negotiations that could have produced a verifiable agreement. Russia's strategic objective: maintain Iran as a strategic partner that erodes American resources in the Middle East, relieves pressure on the Ukrainian front, and provides drones and weaponry for Russian operations. Putin declared that he was ready to expand partnership with Iran after the end of the nuclear deal. China's strategic objective: Iran is the largest supplier of oil to China under sanctioned conditions, at below-market prices. Beijing signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with Tehran in 2021, valued at $400 billion. An Iran under eternal sanctions is a dependent and faithful partner. An Iran with a nuclear agreement with the U.S. becomes much less dependent on Beijing. Analytical interpretation. This is perhaps the most subversive element of the entire analysis. Russia and China have a structural interest in the continuation of the Iranian-American standoff. Each round of failed negotiations, each round of sanctions, each military escalation keeps Iran on the sidelines and erodes American resources. Kutuzov was waiting for the Russian winter. Iran has the tacit support of 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. There is a scenario that emerges from historical analysis compared to the present, not a prediction, but a plausible trajectory that the available data supports. This is the scenario that we could call the Kutuzovization of the Middle East, the progressive transformation of the Iranian-American conflict into a long-lasting conflict of attrition, in which neither side wins decisively, but the cost of maintaining pressure grows asymmetrically on the American side. To understand this scenario, it is necessary to look at what the attrition strategy has historically produced. Kutuzov did not defeat Napoleon in the open field. He defeated him by making the occupation of Moscow unsustainable. Vietnam did not defeat the United States in conventional battles. It defeated it by making the political and human cost of the war unbearable for American public opinion. Afghanistan did not defeat the USSR or the USA in direct confrontation. It exhausted its will to fight over decades. Iran, as an actor, has characteristics that favor erosion. A population of 87 million people with a tradition of national sacrifice. A territory of 1.6 million square kilometers, difficult to occupy. An economy that has learned to function under sanctions for decades. A network of regional allies that multiplies the points of friction for any adversary. And crucially, the implicit support of 2 nuclear powers, Russia and China, that will never let Iran completely collapse. In the attrition scenario, the next 3 to 5 years would follow a logic of oscillation between tactical escalation and performative diplomacy. Negotiations in Geneva and Vienna will produce partial agreements, perhaps a temporary freeze on enrichment in exchange for partial sanctions relief. These agreements will be unstable and reversible, as the 2015 JCPOA turned out to be. On the American side, electoral pressure and the military costs of a permanent presence in the Persian Gulf, 2 aircraft carriers and multiple military assets, will create incentives to accept an imperfect deal that can be sold as victory. Recent history shows that the U.S. has difficulty maintaining maximum pressure strategies indefinitely, especially when its allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have economic interests that include stability, not permanent conflict. On the Iranian side, the interim council that replaced Khamenei will face contradictory pressures: the guardians of the revolution faction that prefers total resistance, the pragmatic current of President Pezeshkian that recognizes the need for economic relief, and the pressure of a population that experienced the bombings of June 2025 and wants solutions. This internal tension is real and can produce concessions, but the concessions will be tactical, not strategic. The most disturbing element of the attrition scenario is what happens to Iran's nuclear program during this period of wobble. American intelligence agencies assess that Iran has not yet resumed a weapons program, but has undertaken activities that put it in a better position to produce a nuclear device if it so desires. This formulation, the so-called nuclear threshold, is exactly the objective of the Iranian strategy: not to have the bomb, but to be permanently a few months away from having it. This position of calculated ambiguity is the nuclear equivalent of Kutuzov's strategy: not to win decisively, but never to be definitively defeated. In 3 to 5 years, if the attrition scenario is confirmed, Iran will probably have rebuilt part of the capabilities destroyed in June 2025, in a dispersed and hardened form, more difficult to attack in a second operation. With each attack rebuild cycle, Iran's nuclear program becomes more resilient and more distributed. It's the nuclear version of Kutuzov's principle: retreat to preserve the essential and emerge stronger. The Strait of Hormuz, through which around 20% of the world's oil passes, is the most potent geopolitical weapon that Iran possesses. Any serious military escalation that threatens to close the strait would produce an immediate global energy shock. The price of a barrel could exceed $200, with knock-on effects on global inflation, emerging economies, and the cohesion of Western alliances. This latent threat, never fully activated but never fully removed, is another element of the attrition strategy: keeping the adversary aware of the potential cost of full escalation, without ever provoking him to the point of making escalation inevitable. Kutuzov never completely eliminated the possibility of a decisive battle. He kept it as a threat that partially immobilized Napoleon. For Russia and China, this scenario is virtually ideal. The US and Israel spend military, political, and economic resources in a region peripheral to their long-term strategic interests, while Moscow and Beijing consolidate their positions in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific, respectively. The wear and tear in the Middle East is the Russian winter that drains the great American army. The attrition scenario does not predict a spectacular Iranian victory. It predicts something more subtle and in many ways more disturbing: the gradual erosion of the American ability to maintain effective pressure on all its adversaries simultaneously, in a world that has become definitively multipolar after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Kutuzov did not need to destroy Napoleon in the open field. It was enough to wait for the great army to destroy itself. There is a scene that historians often describe in their memoirs of the Napoleonic campaign of 1812. After Napoleon entered Moscow and waited weeks for the Russian capitulation that never came, his marshals asked Kutuzov, who was watching from afar, what he planned to do. Kutuzov responded with a phrase that went down in the history of military strategy: patience and time. These are my strongest warriors. It is impossible not to hear an echo of this phrase in the statements of Abbas Arachi in Geneva, or of Deputy Minister Tokhtaravanchi when he states that the ball is in the U.S. court. It is impossible not to recognize the Kutuzovian logic in Iran's refusal to discuss ballistic missiles, not out of stubbornness, but because each structural concession reduces the deterrence power that is, ultimately, the regime's only guarantee of survival. What contemporary geopolitical analysis often fails to capture is precisely this temporal element. We live in an era of 24-hour news cycles, of short-term metrics, of presidencies and mandates that demand visible results within months. Real geopolitics, the kind that determines the fate of nations and civilizations, operates across decades and generations. Islamic Iran has existed for 47 years and has survived a devastating war with Iraq, decades of sanctions, assassinations of leaders and scientists, sophisticated cyber attacks, and now direct bombings of its nuclear facilities. This durability is no accident. It is the result of a strategy that, consciously or not, embodies the principles that Kutuzov demonstrated in 1812, the refusal to be defeated on the adversary's terms, the preservation of the essential when the accessory can be sacrificed, the use of time as a weapon when conventional weapons are insufficient. This does not mean that Iran will win this conflict. The strategy of attrition has its own limits. The Iranian economy is under enormous pressure. Khamenei's death created an unprecedented crisis of succession and legitimacy. Popular protests show that resistance to the regime from within has not disappeared. Attrition is a survival strategy, not necessarily a victory strategy. But the question that remains and which the coming years will answer is this: who wears out the fastest? Iran, which is fighting for its survival in an existential war and can count on the implicit support of Moscow and Beijing, or the United States, which must simultaneously manage the Iranian threat, the war in Ukraine, China's growing pressure in the Indo-Pacific, and the internal fractures of its own democracy. Kutuzov understood that Napoleon, the most powerful man in Europe, with the largest army in history, had a structural weakness. He needed to win quickly to maintain the cohesion of his empire and the legitimacy of his leadership. Slowness was a weapon that Napoleon was unable to use, but that Kutuzov mastered. The question that the coming years will answer, and that this video leaves you to reflect on, is: in an era of elections every 4 years, of markets that react to every tweet and every presidential statement, of public opinions that demand visible and immediate victories, which power really has the capacity to play in the long term? Iran, which has already survived 47 years of siege, or the United States, the greatest military power in history, but whose political system rewards quick decisions and penalizes strategic patience? Are we facing a passing event in the eternal cycle of tensions in the Middle East, or the visible beginning of a structural change in the global balance of power, in which strategic patience may prove to be more decisive than conventional military power? If this analysis made you think differently about news from the Middle East, subscribe to the channel, because geopolitics rarely reveals its secrets in 24 hours. Reveal them in decades, and we will be here to analyze them.